For the first 50 years of its life, the diesel engine belonged to the rich. Ships, locomotives, factory generators. The pump that fed it fuel was a precision instrument, one metering element for every cylinder, and it priced the small diesel right out of reach. The tractor engine, the delivery truck engine, stayed a gasoline job. Then, a repairman from Connecticut bolted a spinning rotor into a housing the size of a coffee can. Therefore, the math changed. This is the Roosa Master. To understand why that pump mattered, the story starts underground, in the basements of New York City, in the years right after the Second World War. Down there, behind the boilers and the fuse panels, sat the diesel-electric generator sets that kept the buildings breathing. Keeping them alive was a mechanic named Vernon Roosa. Roosa was not a professor with a research budget. He was the man a landlord called at 2 in the morning when the generator quit. The engine he serviced had been around since the 1890s, when Rudolf Diesel built a motor that needed no spark. It squeezed air until the air itself turned hot enough to light the fuel. It was efficient. It was durable. But for 50 years, it stayed trapped inside big iron. Ships ran on diesel. Locomotives ran on diesel. Hospitals and factories ran on diesel. Therefore, the engine had a home, but it was a mansion, not a farmhouse. The reason came down to a single part. To fire, a diesel needs fuel forced into the cylinder at enormous pressure, at exactly the right instant. The device that did that job was the inline injection pump, and Bosch had been mass-producing them since 1927. The pump was like a small engine bolted to the side of the big one. Inside sat one pumping element for every cylinder the engine had. 6 cylinders meant 6 plungers and 6 barrels, each fitted to tolerances measured in millionths of an inch. Every one of those elements had to be machined, matched, and hand-calibrated. Therefore, the pump was heavy, complex, and expensive to build. And every small diesel that might have used one had to carry 6 precision pumping elements, when a single well-made element could have done the metering for them all. So the small, high-speed diesel, the kind that could sit on a tractor or under the hood of a delivery truck, stayed a fantasy. That work belonged to gasoline. Roosa knew the sound of that limitation. The cold morning knock of a diesel catching, the clatter of an engine only the wealthy industries could afford to feed. By the late 1940s, he had been turning the same problem over for years, ever since an idea first struck him back in 1941. Every night in those basements, staring at 6 hand-fitted plungers doing one simple job, he kept circling the same question. Why 6? Why not 1? The answer Roosa kept arriving at was almost too simple to trust. Instead of 6 plungers, each firing its own cylinder, he pictured one. A single pumping element that would spin, taking turns feeding every cylinder in sequence, the way the rotor in a car's ignition distributor hands a spark to each plug in its turn. 1 plunger, doing the work of 6. The idea carried a hidden gift. Because the very same plunger pressurized the fuel for every cylinder, every shot of fuel came out identical. An engine no longer needed 6 hand-matched elements that all had to agree with one another. It needed one element, repeating itself, thousands of times a minute. That meant fewer parts to machine, fewer parts to fail, and a pump body small enough to cradle in 2 hands. There was a second gift, and it mattered even more. An engine builder who wanted a small diesel no longer had to design and calibrate a bespoke injection system of his own. He could bolt on a finished pump that already worked. Therefore, the cost of putting a diesel into a tractor or a truck did not just fall. It moved off the manufacturer's bench entirely. Roosa had worked all of this out in his head by 1941. But an idea is not a pump. He had no factory, no capital, no way to turn a sketch into hardened steel that could survive 2,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, over and over, for years. Therefore, the idea sat. For 6 years, it went nowhere. Then, in 1947, it reached an unlikely place. The Hartford Machine Screw Company had been making fasteners in Connecticut since 1876, when Christopher Spencer founded it to run his automatic screw machines. The war had kept the plant busy, turning out precision parts. But with the fighting over, the fastener orders thinned, and Hartford went looking for something new to build. A rotary diesel pump that nobody else in the world was making was exactly the kind of gamble they needed. So Hartford brought Roosa in. That June, he arrived with a development engineer named Ernest Wilson, and a third man, Leonard Baxter, joined the effort. The following year, the whole operation moved onto 27 acres in Windsor, and the real work began. Turning the concept into a production pump was slow, stubborn engineering. The rotor had to seal against enormous pressure while spinning at high speed. The transfer pump feeding it had to hold steady. The hydraulic head had to route fuel to each outlet at exactly the right instant, every instant, without fail. A design this clean on paper hid 1,000 small problems in metal. It took until 1952. That year, the first real order landed. 500 Roosa Master Model A pumps. 500 does not sound like the beginning of an industrial shift. But every one of those pumps was proof that the thing worked, that a single spinning plunger really could feed a whole engine reliably and cheaply at a size and price no inline pump could come near. And that was the quiet danger hiding inside the design. Its genius was that it did everything mechanically. One moving heart handling the metering, the timing, and the distribution all at once, with no help from anything electric. That purity was its great strength in 1952. Decades later, it would become the one weakness the Roosa Master could never engineer its way out of. For now, though, none of that mattered. Word of the little pump was already spreading beyond the city, and the industry about to fall in love with it was waiting out in the open fields of rural America. The Model A had proven the concept. What came next proved the market. Through the 1950s, Roosa's team kept refining the pump. The Model D followed, and by the late 1950s, came a version built around a die-cast housing. That sounds like a footnote. It was not. Die casting meant the pump body could be produced faster and cheaper than one machined from solid stock, which drove the price down again and pushed the pump toward the exact market it had always been built for. That market was the American farm. For decades, the farm tractor had run on gasoline, or on kerosene, or on an awkward gasoline start, diesel run compromise. Diesel promised more pulling power and far better fuel economy, the two things a farmer working a field all day cared about most. What had kept diesel off the tractor was cost, and the single biggest piece of that cost had just been solved. Therefore, the tractor makers came, one after another. In 1960, John Deere fitted the Roosa Master to its new 1010 and 2010 tractors, but Deere was not even the first. International Harvester had already adopted it, and once the giants committed, the rest fell in line quickly. J.E. Case, Alice Chalmers, Ford, Oliver, Minneapolis, Moline. The list of holdouts kept shrinking until there was none left. By 1961, practically every diesel farm tractor built in the United States carried a Roosa Master pump bolted to its engine. A single design, worked out by a repairman in a basement 20 years earlier, had become the standard of an entire nation's agriculture. The pump could feed engines up to 200 horsepower. It was compact enough for a small utility tractor and tough enough for a heavy crawler. And because every shot of fuel it delivered matched the last, the engines it fed ran smoother and started easier than the farmers had any right to expect. The clatter of a diesel tractor turning over on a cold morning, once the sound of costly industrial machinery, became the ordinary soundtrack of rural America. But the tractor was only the opening. Once the pump existed, cheap and reliable and made by the 100,000, diesel began slipping into every corner gasoline had owned. It went into light and medium trucks. It went into marine engines for fishing boats and working craft. It went into the generator sets, irrigation pumps, and construction machines that build and feed a growing country. Every one of those markets had been waiting on the same thing, an affordable way to meter diesel fuel. And now it existed. The company behind it grew to match. Hartford Machine Screw had already become Standard Screw. Now, as the diesel pump business dwarfed everything else it made, the name changed again to Stanadyne, keeping a piece of the old name and adding a nod to the dynamometer, the instrument that measures an engine's power. Demand ran so far ahead of one Connecticut plant that Stanadyne licensed the design overseas to the British firm CAV. The arrangement drew a line down the middle of the world. Stanadyne would build the pump for the Americas, and CAV would build it abroad, each staying out of the other's territory. That one design, in Windsor and under license, would eventually be produced in staggering numbers. Across Stanadyne and its licensees worldwide, the count of distributor pumps built would climb toward 23 million. 23 million, from an idea a man once could not get anyone to fund. Stanadyne kept improving the breed. Its engineers developed the pencil nozzle injector, a slim design that sprayed fuel into the center of the cylinder and squeezed still more efficiency out of the engines the pump served. For most of 2 decades, the Roosa Master had no real rival in its class. It had taken the diesel engine down off the ship and the locomotive and set it to work in the hands of ordinary people. But the same mechanical purity that had put it in nearly every diesel tractor in 1961 was about to collide with something no arrangement of rotor and plunger could ever satisfy. A change was coming to the air over America's cities, and to the laws deciding what an engine was allowed to breathe out. The change did not come from a competitor. It came from the air itself. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the exhaust pouring out of diesel engines became a public problem. Governments in America and Europe began writing emissions rules that tightened with every passing year, setting hard limits on the soot and the nitrogen oxides an engine was allowed to release. Meeting those limits demanded something the Roosa Master, for all its brilliance, could not fully give. It demanded control. A purely mechanical pump meter's fuel the same way every time, governed by springs, weights, and the shape of a cam. That sameness was its gift. But an engine trying to run clean has to change its fueling constantly, shifting the timing and the quantity from one moment to the next, reading load and temperature and speed, and correcting faster than any spring can move. That kind of precision belongs to a computer. This was the weakness that had been hiding inside the design from the very start. The mechanical purity that made the pump cheap in 1952, that let it do everything with no electricity at all, was the exact thing now holding it back. A spring cannot be argued into obeying an emissions standard. Stanadyne saw it coming and fought to adapt. Its engineers built the DS model, an electronically governed version of the rotary pump, the first of its kind to let a control unit manage what springs and weights once did alone. It was clever work, and it stretched the life of the distributor pump by years. Therefore, the concept did not die all at once. It evolved, and it bought time. But the industry was already moving toward a different architecture entirely. In the common rail system, the pump does just one job, building pressure, while a computer and a set of electronic injectors decide exactly when and how much fuel each cylinder gets, firing several precise bursts in a single stroke. It could hit targets the rotary pump could only chase. It ran quieter, cleaner, more efficient. And once it matured, the mechanical distributor pump had nowhere left to go. So the pump that had spent 2 decades as the standard of an industry slid quietly into the role of yesterday's technology. New engine designs stopped specifying it. Production wound down. The rotor that had spun in the heart of millions of engines began, at last, to slow. Vernon Roosa lived to see his single spinning plunger reach nearly every farm in the country. He would not see the technology that finally replaced it become ordinary. But before this story reaches the barns and workshops where the Roosa Master still turns today, it is worth measuring what this one small pump had actually done, because the full scale of it is easy to miss. The mechanism was only half of what made the Roosa Master matter. The other half was its reach. Roughly 23 million distributor pumps, built across Stanadyne and its licensees. A design that began as one man's basement sketch became one of the most produced pieces of diesel hardware in history. For a generation of tractors, trucks, boats, and generators, if the engine was a small diesel, the odds were strong that a descendant of Roosa's pump was feeding it. In 1988, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers recognized what the pump had done, naming the Roosa Master a historic mechanical engineering landmark. The honor did not go to a warship or a power plant or some towering feat of scale. It went to a part almost nobody who depended on it ever saw, tucked against the side of an engine block, quietly doing its job. That recognition points at the real legacy, which is not the count of units or the plaque on the wall. It is what the pump moved. For half a century, the diesel engine had been an instrument of heavy industry, a machine for those who could afford its complicated appetite. Roosa's rotor took that engine and handed it to the farmer, the trucker, the boat owner, the small builder. It closed the gap between what diesel could do and who could pay to do it. The company he helped build carried on. Standard screw had become Stanadyne, and Stanadyne kept innovating long after the mechanical rotary pump's heyday passed, moving into electronic governing, common rail components, and precision fuel systems for a new century. The fastener shop that Christopher Spencer founded in 1876 had transformed itself, through one repairman's idea, into a diesel injection company that outlived the very technology that made its name. But the strangest part of the Roosa Master's story is not in a museum, or a corporate timeline, or a landmark citation. It is out in the working world, in barns and backlot workshops, where these pumps refuse to become history at all. At antique tractor shows across the American Midwest, the Roosa Master is still there, still turning. Restored Deeres and Fords and cases idle in the sun, and inside a good many of them, that same little rotary pump is metering fuel exactly as it did 60 years ago. The engines catch with the old familiar knock, and the pumps just keep working. They keep working because they are fixable. That is the quiet grace of a purely mechanical design. When a Roosa Master finally wears, the trouble shows itself gently. It weeps a little fuel from a tired seal, and a kit to cure it costs about as much as a nice lunch. A patient owner with a clean bench and a service manual can bring one back to life. Whole small shops still exist to rebuild nothing else, and enthusiasts trade parts and hard-won knowledge in online forums the way their grandfathers once traded them across fence lines. Not every version survived equally. Parts for a few of the odd variants have gone scarce, and those pumps get quietly retired. But the workhorse DB, the one that put diesel on the farm, refuses to disappear. That is the strange afterlife of a part almost nobody was meant to see. Vernon Roosa never set out to build a monument. He set out to answer a small, stubborn question in a basement. Why 6 when 1 would do? The answer he found handed the diesel engine to everyone the old world had priced out, and it is still running in the quiet, still doing the single job it was built for. If you made it this far, you already understand something that rarely gets said out loud. The machines that shape our world are rarely the loud ones. Sometimes the thing that reshapes an entire industry is a part the size of a coffee can, bolted where no one will ever look, built by someone whose name almost nobody remembers. If you enjoy stories like this, the ones about the overlooked hardware that quietly built the modern world, consider subscribing. There is a whole garage full of these machines still waiting to be told, and this channel exists to give them their due. So the next time an old diesel tractor rattles past, listen for the knock, and think of Vernon Roosa, and the one spinning plunger that did the work of 6.